of Bishop's Castle is a load of old solid wall, pretty looking buildings, which are the sort of ones which are hard to heat, hard to insulate. I mean, and so yeah, and the wood yards of relevance because they've got a biomass boiler there. It's got spare heat, so that's a potential heat source. This is Bishop's Castle again, but here we've marked in purple all the properties with heat pumps. So in the kind of lower density, newer areas, there's already quite a lot of heat pumps around. So that sort of undermines the heat network in those areas. And so we used Thermos, which we could talk about at another time if that was of interest. And Thermos is a bit of software which estimates the heat load for each building and works out if I pay this much for the pipe and I sell this much heat, does it make money or not? And so it connects, it has a look at each building individually and works out whether it's worth connecting to the heat network on some assumptions of what the heat costs and what the pipe costs and what you can sell the heat for. And in this case, where I could, I inputted the EPC data for some of these buildings, for as many buildings as I could get, so that the Thermos estimates were a bit more accurate. Otherwise, it's guesstimating by volume of building. And then for the leisure centre and the college, we put in the proper heat loads. And just to say, there is the hospital here, but it's already got a biomass boiler, so that would have been good to connect. But it's already got things going on. So in all, that is 92 connections. Peak heat about 3 megawatts. The focus of the heat is these solid wall buildings because they're the ones that use the most heat. As a quick aside, we also looked at a heat network just using the amount of heat that the woodyard has spare from its biomass boiler, which was quite nice because then there's lower risk because we've already got the heat available. But the pipe route, we want to go to the big loads because they're the easy ones, which is the college and the leisure centre down here. And we're taking the pipe down the high street so that when the scheme grows, we can put in heat pumps down here and grow the network up the high street. So that's something that's quite interesting one because it's just lower risk because you've already got the heat, one less challenge. So going back to the kind of the bigger scheme, the heat sources we had the options on as such were the biomass. We could have our own big biomass boiler or use the boiler which has a bit of spare capacity at the woodyard. Ground source heat pump, closed loop because the BGS map indicates that open loop is not possible there. Air source heat pump. There are no rivers or lakes nearby to take heat out of. There is a sewage works for the town, but it's quite a small amount of heat in compared to what we need. And there's no other sort of industrial or other waste heat sources that you sometimes get. And I put this graph together because I can never get ground source heat pumps to work economically. And I think this is part of the reason. If we model a ground loop, after they get cooler over time, and most of the time they're quite a lot cooler than the air temperature, which is the blue line. So the sort of air source heat pumps seem to win out for me. I'm more than happy for others to discuss this. This is the model of a ground loop for the scheme, 100 boreholes, 300 meters deep, sort of over £1 million worth of cost. And the temperatures just go down over time. So what's that? That's over 20 years. And the red line is the temperature of the ground next to the pipe, and the kind of purple line is the kind of lowest temperature of the fluid that actually comes out of the borehole. And they're quite low. And so this is the challenge I get with ground source heat pumps. I can't get them to work because the COPs aren't very good. Totally different if you've got a waste heat source or you've got cooling and you're putting heat into the ground loop in the summer. And as I understand it, places like the Netherlands, you can have ground loops, but the premises are supposed to be balanced. So you put as much heat in as you take out. And I've worked on ground source schemes where they have kind of fans, so you can top up the heat in the summer as the ground loop gets colder and stuff. So, there are options which I haven't modelled here, but So that's my point of discussion. I struggle with ground source on heat only, and things like, if you're pumping water around 30 kilometers of pipe, that's actually quite a high pumping cost, which sometimes isn't considered. So what the recommendation was an air source heat pump of about 1 megawatt, a big thermal store, so that we can maximize the use of cheap electricity, and we can keep the air source heat pump size down because the thermal store provides for the peaks. Oil backup boilers, which I know is controversial, but I'm very much of the view I'd rather emit some carbon and make the whole scheme economic rather than have no fossil fuels, but the scheme economics are too challenging to achieve. We can always get rid of the boilers later. And we came up with about 6% IRR on that with a wind turbine. And that's the key bit that sort of sets this study apart. So, right, this supply. So, with a 1 megawatt air source heat pump, we get about 92% of the heat from the air source heat pump. If we've got a wind turbine, if we get a bit of PV and we run the air source heat pump when it's more expensive than oil boilers, we can actually get a bit more heat out of it than that. And that 6% is really driven by the fact we've got a 1 megawatt wind turbine, which supplies 61% of the electricity. So so everybody's aware of the difference in price of the electricity from the wind turbine, that if it exports it, it gets very little. Whereas if we have to import electricity for the air source heat pump, it's really quite expensive. And there's a sort of factor of 2 difference in the costs between what you export for and what you import for. So that saves us a vast amount of money. And if we add a bit of PV, we can get the kind of self-generation up to nearly 80%. So that helps the economics even more. And then included in that, if we bring those 2 electrical generation supplies into the energy centre, which is located next to the leisure centre and the college, we can actually private wire supply to those 2 loads as well, and then just import what we need beyond that. So that increases the benefits. So we are still exporting quite a bit. And with that private wire setup, there's no sort of challenges in that. That's something that's been done before. So that's quite an easy thing to achieve, and we know we can achieve that. So the challenges, the capital costs are difficult to estimate because there's little experience really of doing domestic retrofit heat networks like that. The Swap and Prior is an amazing scheme, but the costs are quite frightening. But I'd like to see Swap and Prior as a start of things getting cheaper, as we get more experience. The costs I've used for Bishop's Castle, I've kind of reviewed them against a study for Upper Hayford, which is a village in Oxfordshire, and that was done by consultants. I can't remember who it was, but they were involved in Swap and Prior, so hopefully have a better exposure to the costs than the rest of us have got. But Bishop's Castle is fundamentally a better heat network opportunity, as there's much less DH pipe, the expensive bit for the same heat sales. There's fewer connections, there's fewer people to deal with. The heat pump is sized a bit smaller, which makes it cheaper. It's air source rather than ground source, which makes it cheaper. We've got wind rather than they've predominantly got PV. The wind is much more wind in the winter, which is when you need the electricity for the heat pump. And we've got the additional private wire electricity sales to the leisure centre and college can help. And so I think as a sector, we need to try and find places where district heating has less barriers. And I'd say Bishop's Castle has less barriers because of these reasons than Swap and Prior. And as just a very quick comparison, Swap and Prior's got about 260 buildings they're planning for. We've got about 93. The heat demands are about the same. I've come up with a higher peak demand. But the main thing is, I've estimated these pipe lengths in Thermos, but we've got less than half the pipe length at Bishop's Castle, and that really helps the costs. And this linear heat density is a sort of a metric used in the industry, which is how much heat you sell per metre of pipe, basically. And and by city centre standards, 1.7 at the Bishop's Castle is still very low, but it is quite a lot higher than Swaffham Prior. So I think, I think it's possible. It's a better opportunity. I'd like to think it was possible, and it's great to hear that from John that Hindu are going to fund some more studies, because we need more studies doing. What else am I going to say? So just to summarise on the benefits of central heat networks, because there's been quite a lot of talk of shared ground loop. So I thought I'd put the other perspective. So with a centralised heat network, we can capture kind of expensive to access heat sources. Like, if you want, there's so much mines water around, but you need to drill an expensive borehole to get to it. And you can't do that per house, but you can do that for a centralised network. Or same for open loop, or I put energy from waste there. I missed the beginning of the conversation on energy from waste, but anyway, it's a good heat source if it's there. Or accessing sewers is quite hard work, so that again, it's better done in a large centralized way than can't be done for individual properties. Centralized energy heat networks, you can change the heat sources really quite easily as technology changes over time. There's fantastic graphs of how the transition in Denmark and Sweden from different fuel sources as they decarbonize. It's easier to change one technology in one energy centre than it is to change it in 1,000 houses. The complexity of the technology is within the professional sphere in an energy centre, rather than putting all these fairly complex technologies in each individual home, which the resident needs to understand. I mean, I've looked at a range of solar installations done by various contractors and heat pump installations, and they're never done that well in my experience. And so it's better if the professionals manage that than every householder needs to try and understand that. Centralized thermal storage, which we can store days worth of heat at really low cost, means the heat users can just get on and use heat when they want it. And with the heat stored centrally, we can make the most of a cheap electricity. We can turn off the heat pumps when the electricity is expensive, but we don't need to start trying to get people to adapt how they heat their homes, because that does save money. But if you talk to a housing association or local authorities, but who answers the phone when they say, why is my radiator cold when my heating's on? And people don't, that challenge of that, I think, is sometimes overlooked. An HIU to connect to a heat network is the same size as the combi boiler. So anybody who's got a combi boiler, there's no extra space, because people who've got a combi boiler powered by gas or LPG or oil or something, if they need it, if they're going to have their own heat pump, they've got to find space for a hot water cylinder. And that's quite a challenge that I don't think we've all people don't want to change the heat source anyway. And then you're turning up and saying, and you need to lose your airing cupboard to put this hot water cylinder in. It's quite a challenge. The heat network heat losses, the kind of financial cost of that and the CO2 cost of that is very similar in the study I did to the additional pumping energy required for a large-scale ambient loop. I looked at a scheme in Oxford where we had taking heat from fridges from a large Sainsbury's on the Ring Road, which was enough heat to heat 250 houses. And whether I took that heat in an ambient loop to each house with a heat pump in each house, or whether I did that centrally and circulated the water at 65 degrees, the kind of energy loss in the networks was the same. The ambient loop, because you have to pump so much higher volume of water, has a much higher pumping cost but lose no heat. The kind of conventional heat network loses heat, but because the temperature difference of that water, you're pumping far less water, and so the pumping cost is much less. And I could stop there, is that it? Or I could just say quickly, try to explain the kind of thermal store thing, that this red line's the heat load going up and down, the yellow is the heat pump going, and then we've got the electricity being generated, and we've got the red is the wind turbine, and the blue is the solar. And this green line, which you can just about see, is the kind of electricity use, which is basically the heat pump, basically. And so the heat pump's kind of turning on when there is electricity, and that puts heat in the thermal store. And then when there isn't electricity, it turns off, and the heat and the thermal store drains. And then the sun comes back and the wind comes back out again, and the heat pump goes on. And so this way you can capture you can make the most of the renewable electricity, but also it means when electricity is cheaper overnight, you can move that generation to be using nighttime electricity and fill the thermal store up, rather than run the heat pump when you actually need the heat during the day when the electricity is more expensive. And so there's quite a large grid saving, because you can get everything to turn off at peak demand time, so that the heat pump isn't taking any heat at peak loads time. So that kind of helps reduce the kind of national need for grid reinforcement. And I think I will stop there, unless we want to put a few slides up about the wind turbine, Dave.
Well, if I can just say a few words. I haven't got any slides about the wind turbine, but as Martin's indicated, the wind turbine is crucial to the economics of this. If we're buying grid electricity to supply the heat pump, then we cannot supply heat for cheaper price than oil, even allowing for oil prices to rise substantially in the near future. So the wind turbine is crucial. There are a number of issues, as I'm sure you're aware, particularly here, we are right on the edge of the AONB. But the idea is to have a 1 megawatt wind turbine fairly close to the town. So it's not on the top of the hill, it's sort of in the valley, which normally would not be economic. But because we've got a market for the electricity, we believe it can work and it fits together as a system. So we started off trying to get this wind turbine and the heat network plan into the neighbourhood plan, which happened to be in progress. We had a wind constraints study done, we did a public survey, we had a public meeting, we put policies to the town council, and basically the town council told us that's very nice, very lovely, we'd love to talk to you about it sometime, but we're not going to put it in the neighbourhood plan at this point, and we haven't got the time and the resources to consider this fully, which was a shame. So we then decided to go straight to Shropshire Council with a pre-planning response without having the proposal featured in the neighbourhood plan. And they requested that we had a landscape and visual impact study done, so we got that done, and we submitted a pre-planning out, and we waited 6 months. And we've just got the answer back, and the answer back basically says you need to get it in the neighbourhood plan. So sent us right back to where we were. They did discuss the possibility of getting it in the place plan instead, which actually still wouldn't meet planning guidance, but it might be enough for the planning officers to accept a departure from the guidance. So we're currently, we've got a proposal now to the town council that they support this proposal going into the place plan instead. And just very briefly, the place plan is all about infrastructure and what infrastructure is going to be needed in the area over the coming decades. So we think this fits in very well with the place plan. And crucially, the place plan is run and financed by the county council, who are strapped for cash, but at least they do have some resource and they do have some officer time. Whereas the town council, I mean, yeah, the town council is really more like a parish council. You know, it's very under-resourced. They don't have the expertise. You know, if we do present them with lots of studies, they don't have the resources to actually evaluate those studies. You know, they're completely the wrong gatekeepers for such things. So we're a bit frustrated, but we are pressing ahead. One of the problems we have is that we have some more grant funding available for further work on the planning and ecology studies and what have you. But the funder very sensibly has said that they want to see a positive reply from the pre-planning. And at the moment, we haven't really got that. So we're a bit stymied for cash as well. And I did see that Kayla had made a comment in the notes and about the energy efficiency of these buildings. And yes, they are hard to treat buildings, but there are still things you can do. And one of the partners in this scheme is actually Lightfoot, who are a charity that do household energy surveys, been doing them in Bishop's Castle for very nearly 20 years. And they're fully on board. And the whole idea is that we won't just accept the houses as they are, that everyone who wants to connect to the heat network will get a home energy survey done. They will be advised to improve their thermal efficiency as much as can be done, given the historic nature of the properties. Have I missed anything, Martin?
I don't think so. I'm
Great.
trying to read the questions.
Thank you very much. That's brilliant. That in the current consultation, which we've strongly said to the government is useless and won't free up, they've provided possible avenues, community right to build order and local development orders and stuff like that. Would that make any difference, or would that involve a whole community engagement, expensive community engagement strategy?
Yeah,
process?
we haven't looked at those possibilities yet. There weren't possibilities mentioned by the planning officers, but yes, we're happy to look at that. You're referring to the wind planning consultation. Yeah. Which was, their proposals would see no change at all, really.
No.
So, but I know there was a strong backlash to that, so maybe the final recommendations will actually be a bit stronger. But then there's also talk that the Tories are backing down on doing anything at all. So we shall see.
We have a meeting with the planning minister, which has now been postponed twice, so probably won't on this subject, which probably won't happen until September now.
I could add that we have had discussions with the AONB, and they get it, and they're concerned about climate change. So they're not squealing, "Oh, you can't do that on our AONB." They're very interested. We've also had discussions with CPRE, the Council for Protection of Rural England, and they get it. And the reason, and so, we have this argument that we'll be taking 1 unit of energy out of the wind and converting it into 3 units of heat that's replacing oil and LPG boilers, and the wind turbine needs to be in that location. If it was just connected to the grid, then it's easy for people who don't like wind turbines very much to say, well, put it somewhere else, put it in Wales, out to sea, or Scotland, whereas here it has to be within a certain distance of the town in order for the whole scheme to work.
There's a question about solar thermal evacuated tubes from Kayla, and I know that there's a company called Naked Energy that does evacuated tube hybrid. So the solar, the PV is generating at increased efficiency because it's cooled, and you're generating a thermal byproduct. I don't know if you've thought of looking into that. It's particularly suitable for large applications where there's a co-located heat load.
I've looked at cooling conventional PV with a ground loop, because ground loops I don't think work unless you put some heat in, and I couldn't get it to work. But that's partially because that panel product, which is for heating swimming pools, so keeping PV at a lower than normal temperature, unlike the Naked Energy one, I think, where the PV is kept at a temperature for hot water which is higher than ambient. But a swimming pool, so you'd actually get more out of the PV, and I couldn't quite get it to work, but it would be something I'd like to explore more, because that way you should get a smaller. But there is some of the Danish, there's a Danish company which will do, if your solar's large enough, we'll do you an ESCO deal on solar, and we'll go and build it and sell you heat at the gate. And that's how quite a bit of solar's happened in Denmark, where the investment's all by the private company. And so quite good from a community energy perspective. It could be a separate investment, or if you want that as a heat source, somebody else is bearing all the risks, so one less thing to worry about. But if you've got heat pumps, then it seems to me PV is simpler because there's far less to go wrong. And a solar thermal is about 60% efficient, PV is about 20% efficient, and a heat pump's 300% efficient. So you sort of get to the same place if you've already got your heat pumps there. So and then spare PV can obviously be sold, where spare thermal heat is gets problematic,
especially in the summer.
So
okay, well, if you're on it, I'm happy. But if there's any write-ups, very brief write-ups on innovation that we should be taking account of, please do feed it back to us.
Well, I just want to put out that I always challenge innovation. If you've got a community finance project, how much innovation do you want? Do you actually want stuff which is bankable, reliable, would actually deliver back to shareholders, especially in the heat networks field, which is hard enough as it is? I'd say shy away from innovation because you've got enough challenges, and the whole UK mission on innovation is totally missing best practice, which is continually frustrating to me. We can learn how to do heat networks well and bankably from Denmark, or we can waste a lot of money on innovation doing ideas that the Scandinavians rejected quite a long time ago. That's a bit of a harsh summing up, but it's definitely the case. It's a great bugbear of mine.
Yeah, great. There's some comments on PVT in the comments. Does anybody have any oral questions they'd like to ask Martin or Dave?
So Taylor asked about the EPC ratings. So the EPC ratings for that the area that the pipe went through are all pretty low. And I know Bean said it is possible to insulate listed buildings and solid wall, but it is quite hard. And so if we're trying to decarbonize people who don't want to decarbonize, then I think the heat network's quite good. And generally in these studies, I assume all the sensible, all the immediately economic stuff's done, like the loft insulation and the cavity fill. But if you're solid wall and you insulate later, that's fine, because in somewhere like Bishop's Castle, if you use less heat, the network can grow and serve more places. So it's not a problem if people decarbonize over time. It's a bit more of a problem if you've connected every single house, because then you have spare heat. But as a start of a Bishop's Castle type network, if the houses, we assume we apply all the sensible, immediately economic stuff, and then if in 10 years' time somebody externally insulates, well, we'll just extend the network to a few other houses and use the heat up.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you so much, all of you.